They told me my father died in an accident. They told me my mother passed in peace. And they told me coming back home would help me heal. They lied. I came back to a mountain town that never forgave me for leaving. A house full of silence. A neighbor who watched from the fog like he was guarding a secret. I thought I was burying my past. But the past was waiting for me. With names. With blood. And with a truth powerful enough to burn everything down. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when the dead refuse to stay silent. Welcome to my channel Brinicle Reads. I share new life stories here every day, and I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and like my video. The funeral of my life. They say grief comes in waves, but for me, it was a shipwreck. It started with my mother. A phone call at 3 a.m. that turned the world quiet. I thought that was the worst it could get, standing over a casket in the rain, feeling the dirt of Oakhaven under my heels again. I was wrong. I went back to Chicago to pack my bags, looking for comfort in the man I was supposed to marry. Instead, I found Mark. And I found his colleague in the bed we'd picked out together. Funny how life works. One day you're a successful landscape architect with a diamond on your finger, and the next, you're driving a U-Haul toward a town you swore you'd never see again, with nothing but a box of old photos and a heart that feels like shattered glass. Oakhaven hadn't changed. It was still gray, still damp, and still full of secrets. My mother's house stood at the end of the lane, looking tired, like it had been waiting for me to come home and fail. But as I stepped out into the cold mountain air, I realized I wasn't alone. The cabin next door, the one that had been empty since I was a kid, had smoke rising from the chimney. And standing on the porch was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the mountain itself. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just watched me. I came back here to find peace. But looking into that stranger's eyes, I realized Oakhaven was finished giving me peace. It was time for the truth. The man in the fog. The neighbor's house was a scar on the landscape, a place where the shadows seemed a little deeper and the air a little colder. His name was Cade. He wasn't the kind of man who introduced himself with a handshake and a plate of cookies. He was the kind of man you found standing in the tree line at dusk, perfectly still, watching the perimeter like he was expecting a war. I'd see him through my kitchen window, a silhouette in a grease-stained jacket, working on a rusted engine or staring off into the pines. He had a dog, a massive beast with eyes like amber, that followed him like a silent ghost. Every time our eyes met, my skin crawled. It wasn't just the scars on his hands or the way he carried himself, it was the heavy silence he dragged behind him. I started asking around at the local hardware store. The mentions of his name were always followed by a quick look over the shoulder. They called him a drifter, a man with heavy history. One old-timer whispered about the Iron Row, a biker syndicate that used to run narcotics through the valley. They said Cade was their enforcer until a job turned into a massacre and he vanished. I should have stayed away. I should have kept my doors locked and my head down. But curiosity is a dangerous thing when you've already lost everything else. I started watching him back. I noticed the way he checked the underside of his truck every morning. I noticed the visitors who came after dark, men in blacked-out SUVs who didn't look like they were there for tea. One night, the wind carried the scent of something metallic and sharp to my porch. I looked over and saw him on his back steps, his shirt off, stitching a gash in his side with the steady hands of someone who had done it 100 times before. He looked up and caught me watching. He didn't cover up. He just stared, his eyes hard and hollow, as if he were daring me to ask the question I was too afraid to breathe. I realized then that Cade wasn't just a neighbor. He was a warning. And whatever he was hiding in that cabin was tied to the reason the air in Oakhaven suddenly felt so heavy. Shadows of Oakhaven. The deeper I dug into my mother's house, the more I realized she hadn't just left me a property, she'd left me a crime scene. I found the first envelope tucked behind a loose floorboard in her bedroom. It wasn't a bill or a letter of condolence. It was a legal notice from Vanguard Development, signed by a man named Silas Vane. The tone was polite, but the subtext was a blade to the throat: sell the land, or we will make it worthless. I didn't have time to process the threat before Silas Vane showed up in person. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like success: expensive wool coat, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a voice that sounded like silk sliding over gravel. He talked about progress and revitalization, but he kept looking at the old drainage vein at the edge of the woods. He offered me a check that should have solved all my problems, yet my gut told me that if I signed it, I'd be signing a death warrant for the truth. The pressure didn't stay polite for long. 2 nights later, the windows of my mother's sunroom were shattered. No rocks, just the clean, terrifying holes of a suppressed firearm. I was huddled on the floor, glass in my hair, when the front door groaned open. I thought it was Vane's men coming to finish the job, but it was Cade. He didn't say a word. He just hauled me up and shoved a heavy iron fireplace poker into my hands. He spent the rest of the night on my porch, a dark sentinel against the rain. When the sun came up, I followed him back to his cabin, demanding answers. That's when I saw the files on his desk. He wasn't just a biker or a drifter. He was a collector of Vanguard's sins. He showed me what the town had tried to forget: the accidental, chemical leaks in the 90s, the sick families, and the people who tried to speak up and simply disappeared. The investigation led me to the attic, to a trunk filled with my father's old work clothes. Deep in the lining of his coat, I found a microjournal. The handwriting was frantic, dated weeks after his supposed death in the mountain pass. My father hadn't died in an accident. He had been hunted. And as I read the final entry, I realized that the man living next door hadn't been watching me out of malice. He had been guarding the daughter of the man who saved his life. Blood and ink. The truth didn't just come out, it bled out. I spent 3 days submerged in my father's journals, the ink blurring under my tears as the reality of my life reframed itself. Everything I believed, my childhood, my father's accident, my mother's quiet sadness, was a lie constructed to keep me breathing. My father, Arthur, hadn't been a victim of the mountains. He had been a man who knew too much about the poison Vanguard Development was pumping into our soil, and he had paid for that knowledge with his identity. I confronted Cade in the middle of a thunderstorm, the rain lashing against the cabin logs. I threw the journal onto his table, demand after demand screaming from my throat until my voice cracked. He finally looked at me, not with the coldness of a stranger, but with the weary eyes of a soldier who had been holding a line for 20 years. He told me how my father had saved him from a burning wreck during his days with the Iron Row. He told me how my mother had helped Arthur stage his death, spiriting him away to a dead zone in the high north where Vanguard's reach couldn't find him. "He's alive, Elena," Cade whispered, the words hitting me harder than the thunder. "He's been waiting for the day the evidence was strong enough to bring Vane down. He's been waiting for you to be ready." But Silas Vane wasn't waiting. He knew the clock was ticking. The intimidation shifted from shattered glass to attempted murder. That evening, as the fog rolled in thick enough to swallow the trees, a fleet of black SUVs cut off the main road. Vane's consultants, men with cold eyes and tactical gear, descended on the property. They weren't there to talk land prices anymore. They were there to burn the evidence, and us along with it. Cade moved with a lethal fluidity I had only ever seen in movies. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was a weapon. He pushed me into the crawlspace beneath the kitchen, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Don't come out until you hear me whistle," he said. "No matter what you hear, you stay in the dark." For the next hour, my world was reduced to the smell of damp earth and the terrifying sounds of violence above my head. The floorboards groaned. I heard the sharp, metallic cracks of gunfire and the heavy thud of bodies hitting wood. I heard Silas Vane's voice, no longer silky, screaming orders to find the files. I clutched my father's journal to my chest, my knuckles white, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years. Suddenly, a flare ignited outside, casting a demonic red glow through the cracks in the floorboards. I saw Cade through the slats, pinned against the porch railing, blood slicking his face. Vane stood over him, a pistol leveled at his head. Vane wanted the location of the original soil surveys, the blood records, that proved the mass poisoning. "Where is it, Cade?" Vane sneered. "Is it worth your life? Is it worth the girls?" Cade just spat blood at Vane's polished shoes and laughed. It was a hollow, haunting sound. "You're looking at the wrong man, Silas." From the tree line, a new shadow emerged. A man older, grayer, but with a stride that matched my own. He held a rifle with the steady confidence of a man who had been ghosting these woods for 2 decades. It was my father. He didn't look like a ghost, he looked like vengeance. The standoff felt like an eternity. My father's presence broke Vane's composure. In that split second of hesitation, Cade lunged. The scene exploded into a chaos of movement. My father fired, disabling the lead gunman, while Cade tackled Vane over the railing and into the mud. I scrambled out from the crawlspace, fueled by a frantic mix of terror and adrenaline. I ran toward the porch, slipping on the wet grass, my eyes locked on the man I had mourned for 20 years. He turned toward me, his face illuminated by the dying flare. "Elena," he choked out. We didn't have time for a cinematic reunion. The remaining vanguard men were retreating, but not before one of them tossed a lit incendiary toward the house. The dry cedar ignited instantly. Cade, covered in mud and gasping for air, dragged Vane's unconscious body away from the flames while my father pulled me back from the heat. We stood there in the mud, a broken soldier, a resurrected father, and a woman who had finally found her backbone, watching the house burn. The evidence was gone, or so Vane thought. But as the sirens began to wail in the distance, I reached into my jacket and felt the weight of the microjournal. I had the names. I had the dates. And for the first time in my life, I had the power to finish what my father started. The ink was dry, but the blood was still fresh. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were the reckoning. The rose and anchor. The fire took the house, but it couldn't touch the foundation. In the weeks that followed the siege, the silence of Oakhaven was replaced by the roar of a legal hurricane. With my father's journals and the files Cade had spent years collecting, the blood records became the lead weight that pulled Vanguard Holdings into the depths. Silas Vane's wool coats were traded for orange jumpsuits, and the corporate entity was dismantled piece by piece, its assets frozen and redistributed to the families who had suffered in silence for decades. The recovery was slow, and the reunion with my father was even slower. We had to learn how to be family again in the gaps between depositions and court dates. He was a man who had lived in the gray for 20 years, and I was a woman who had finally stepped out of it. We spent long afternoons on the scorched earth of the property, not talking about the past, but planning a future that didn't involve hiding. 1 year later, the smell of smoke has been replaced by the scent of toasted flour and steamed ginger. I decided not to rebuild the house exactly as it was. Instead, I used the settlement money to transform my mother's old, dilapidated dumpling shop on the edge of the town square into something permanent. We called it the Rose and Anchor. The name was a nod to my mother's grace and the man who had kept me from drifting away when the storm hit its peak. The shop is a success in a way I never expected. People come for the food, but they stay for the atmosphere, a place built on the truth, finally. My father sits in the corner booth most mornings, drinking black coffee and reading the local paper, finally able to use his real name without looking over his shoulder. He's grayer now, his hands a bit shakier, but his eyes are clear. He's no longer a ghost, he's a grandfather to a town that finally knows his story. Then there's Cade. He didn't leave when the danger vanished. He traded his tactical gear for an apron and his Glock for a kitchen knife. Watching him move through the steam of the kitchen, his scarred hands expertly folding dough, you wouldn't know he was once the most feared man in the valley. The shadows in his eyes have receded, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that only shows itself when he looks at me. He still doesn't talk much, but he doesn't have to. We've shared enough silence to last a lifetime. Last night, after the last customer had gone and the closed sign was flipped, we stood on the pier behind the shop, watching the moon reflect off the mountain lake. The water was still, no monsters beneath the surface, no hidden poison in the silt. Cade reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming wooden box. He hadn't gone to a jeweler in the city. He had carved it himself from a piece of cedar salvaged from the ruins of my mother's house. Inside wasn't a diamond, but a simple band of hammered gold. I spent a long time guarding things I thought were lost, he said, his voice still like gravel but softer now. I'd like to spend the rest of my time building something that stays. I didn't need to think. I didn't need to weigh the risks or look for an exit strategy. I took his hand, the gold cool against my skin, and felt the final piece of my heart click into place. My life in Chicago feels like a dream I had in another lifetime. Mark, the skyscrapers, the curated perfection, it was all a shell. Here, in the damp air of Oakhaven, surrounded by the people who bled for me, I finally know what it means to be home. We aren't the people we were when we met. We are scarred, we are weathered, and we are entirely new. The Rose and Anchor is more than a business, it's our sanctuary. And as the sun rises over the peaks, lighting up the sign on the door, I realize that sometimes you have to lose everything to find the one thing that actually matters. The truth doesn't just set you free. It gives you a place to stand. That's it. If you liked it, show me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Let's see how many of us there are. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is. I'm so curious to know where all you wonderful people are tuning in from.